In the spring of 1945, a Wehrmacht sergeant named Klaus Becker sat in a makeshift prisoner of war camp near Remagen, Germany, holding something that made no sense. It was an American submachine gun, stamped sheet metal, crude welds. It looked like something assembled in a garage workshop, not a military arsenal. He turned it over in his hands, examining the simple wire stock, the utilitarian design. Then, an American lieutenant told him something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This weapon, the M3 submachine gun, cost $20 to manufacture, $20 American. Becker's hands stopped moving. He looked down at the weapon again, then back at the lieutenant. $20. His own MP40, the submachine gun he had carried through France, through Russia, through the long retreat back into Germany, had cost the Reich $57 to produce, nearly 3 times as much. This is the story of how German soldiers discovered that they had been fighting a war they could never win, not because of tactics or courage or training, but because of simple mathematics. Because while German engineers crafted precision weapons in factories that required skilled labor, the Americans were stamping out crude but effective guns at a fraction of the cost. And by the time German soldiers understood this reality, it was already far too late. The war was over, the Reich had lost, and the ugly American grease gun had helped prove that sometimes the weapon that looks like junk is the one that wins. It starts in December 1942, when 2 nations approached the same problem with completely different philosophies. December 1942, while German forces were encircled at Stalingrad and American troops were bleeding in North Africa, 2 weapons were being born in factories thousands of miles apart. In Germany, Werke in Erfurt was manufacturing the MP40, a submachine gun that represented the pinnacle of German engineering, efficiency. In America, Guide Lamp Division, a General Motors factory in Anderson, Indiana, was welding together something that looked more like plumbing equipment than a weapon of war. Both nations needed cheap, mass-produced submachine guns. Both faced similar constraints. Skilled labor was scarce, raw materials were precious, time was running out, but they approached the problem with fundamentally different philosophies, and those philosophies would reveal everything about how each nation fought the war. The MP40 was born from German military tradition. When Hugo Schmeisser and his team at Werke designed it in 1938, they were building on decades of firearms expertise. The MP40 replaced the earlier MP38, which itself had been a revolutionary weapon, the first submachine gun designed specifically for mass production with stamped steel parts instead of machined components. But even the simplified MP40 reflected German sensibilities. The receiver was made from stamped steel, yes, but it was precisely formed. The barrel was chrome-lined for extended life. The bolt and firing mechanism were machined to tight tolerances. The folding stock was ingeniously designed, using a vertical magazine housing that doubled as a forward grip. It was elegant, functional. It felt substantial in a soldier's hands. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Production of the MP40 required approximately 15 hours of skilled and semi-skilled labor per weapon. The weapon had 36 individual parts, not counting the magazine. Each part required specific tooling, specific quality control checks. The weapon chambered the 9mm parabellum cartridge, a powerful round that had been standard in German military weapons since the Luger pistol of World War I. Unit cost in 1942, $57. That is approximately $1,000 in today's money. For the Reich, this was actually a triumph of cost reduction. The earlier MP38 had cost even more. The MP40 represented German engineering at its most efficient, streamlining production without sacrificing the fundamental quality that German weapons were known for. But $57 was still expensive, and by 1942, Germany was discovering that expensive weapons were becoming a luxury the Reich could no longer afford. Meanwhile, in Indiana, American engineers were taking a completely different approach. George Hyde, the designer of the M3 submachine gun, did not care about tradition. He cared about one thing, making a weapon so simple that a factory worker who had been assembling car headlights last month could build it today. Hyde's design philosophy was brutal in its pragmatism. The receiver would be two pieces of stamped sheet metal welded together. The barrel would be a simple steel tube, not chrome-lined, not precision-machined. The bolt would be a heavy chunk of metal with grooves cut into it. The trigger mechanism would use the absolute minimum number of parts necessary for the weapon to function. No frills, no polish, no concessions to tradition. The weapon would fire from an open bolt using straight blowback operation, the crudest and most reliable system in firearms engineering. A child could understand how it worked. More importantly, a semi-skilled worker could assemble one in less than 4 hours. The M3 submachine gun weighed just over 8 pounds unloaded. It was approximately 29 inches long with its wire stock extended. Rate of fire, 450 rounds per minute, deliberately slower than most submachine guns to improve controllability. It fed from a 30-round detachable box magazine and was chambered in 45 ACP, the same powerful cartridge used in the Thompson submachine gun and the standard M1911 pistol. The weapon had 23 parts. Assembly time, 3.7 hours. Unit cost, $20. That is approximately $360 in today's money. Less than half the cost of a simplified Thompson. Less than 1/3 the cost of an MP40. The Americans had solved the same problem the Germans faced, but they had solved it with a completely different answer. And German soldiers had no idea what they were up against. Through 1943 and into 1944, German troops continued to carry their MP40s with pride. The weapon had earned a fearsome reputation. British and American soldiers called it the Schmeisser, even though Hugo Schmeisser had not actually designed it. It was fast-firing, reliable, and distinctly German. When you heard the sharp, rapid crack of an MP40, you knew you were fighting Wehrmacht or SS troops. German propaganda emphasized the technological superiority of Reich weapons. Newsreels showed German soldiers wielding MP40s, MG42 machine guns, Panzerfaust, anti-tank weapons. The message was clear. German engineering was the best in the world. German weapons were proof of Aryan superiority. Quality would triumph over quantity. But beneath the propaganda, German ordnance officers were beginning to understand a terrible truth. Quality was expensive, and Germany was running out of money, resources, and time. By 1944, Germany had produced approximately 1 million MP40 submachine guns since production began in 1940. That sounds impressive until you compare it to American production. By December 1944, the United States had manufactured over 600,000 M3 grease guns in just 2 years of production. And that did not even count the 1.5 million Thompson submachine guns, the M1 carbines, the M1 Garand rifles. The Americans were not just outproducing Germany, they were drowning the Reich in weapons. But German soldiers on the front lines did not know these numbers. They knew only what they could see with their own eyes. Their MP40s were reliable. American weapons seemed plentiful, but German troops assumed that was simply because America had more factories, more workers, more resources. They did not yet understand that the Americans had fundamentally changed the equation, that they had designed weapons specifically to be cheap, to be mass-produced by semi-skilled labor, to flood the battlefield with adequate firepower rather than limited numbers of superior weapons. That realization would come later, in prisoner of war camps, in the ruins of the Reich, when it was far too late to matter. The first German soldiers to encounter the M3 grease gun in combat had mixed reactions. Some laughed at it. The weapon looked ridiculous compared to the sleek, purposeful lines of the MP40. Stamped metal that looked like it might bend if you dropped it. A wire stock that seemed fragile. No elegant curves. No sense that a craftsman had built this weapon. One Waffen-SS officer, captured in France in August 1944, later recalled his first impression. "We found several of these American weapons in a captured supply depot. My men picked them up, examined them, and made jokes. One soldier said it looked like something a plumber would use. Another said the Americans must be running out of real weapons. We did not take them seriously. But other German soldiers noticed something else. The M3 worked. It was crude, yes, but it functioned, and there were so many of them. American tank crews carried them. American paratroopers carried them. They were dropped to French resistance fighters, to Italian partisans. Everywhere German troops looked, there were more M3 grease guns. A Wehrmacht lieutenant, captured near Aachen in October 1944, described the psychological impact. We would capture an American position and find these crude submachine guns everywhere, in the tanks, in the trucks. It seemed every American soldier who was not carrying a rifle had one of these grease guns. We began to realize that the Americans could afford to give these weapons to anyone. Tank drivers, truck drivers, clerks. That was when some of us started to understand how badly we were outnumbered. The MP40, by contrast, was a precious resource. Infantry units received them, yes, but not in unlimited quantities. Tank crews often made do with pistols. Support troops carried rifles or older weapons. The Reich could not afford to arm everyone with submachine guns, even though combat experience had proven their value in close quarters fighting. By late 1944, some German units were so desperate for weapons that they began using captured Soviet PPS-41 submachine guns, even American weapons when they could get ammunition for them. The proud Wehrmacht, the military force that had conquered most of Europe, was reduced to scavenging enemy weapons because German factories could not produce enough guns fast enough. And still, most German soldiers did not understand why. They assumed it was because of bombing raids, because of sabotage, because of resource shortages. They did not yet grasp that even if German factories had been untouched, even if raw materials had been unlimited, they still could not have matched American production, because the Americans had changed the rules of the game. Then came the spring of 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Allied armies were pushing into Germany from east and west. Millions of German soldiers were surrendering, and in prisoner of war camps across Europe, they began to have conversations with their captors. Conversations that would shatter their understanding of the war they had just lost. Klaus Becker had been a good soldier. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, fought in Poland, in France, in Russia. He had survived Stalingrad, though his unit had been rotated out before the final encirclement. He had retreated through Ukraine, through Poland, back into Germany. He had seen the endless columns of Soviet tanks, the swarms of American aircraft. He had watched the Reich shrink week by week, month by month, but he had never stopped believing that German weapons were superior. That belief was one of the few things that kept him going. Yes, the Allies had more of everything, more men, more tanks, more planes, but German engineering was better. A Tiger tank could destroy 5 Shermans. An MG42 could cut down entire platoons. The MP40 in his hands was reliable, accurate, well-made. Quality would have to be enough, because quantity was no longer possible. In April 1945, Becker's unit was captured near Remagen. The fighting had been brief and confused. American artillery had shattered their positions before dawn. American infantry had surrounded them by mid-morning. There had been no point in continuing. The ammunition was gone. The food was gone. The will to fight was gone. In the prisoner of war camp, Becker found himself sitting across from an American lieutenant who spoke decent German. The lieutenant was young, perhaps 23 or 24. He seemed curious about German weapons, asked technical questions about the MP40, about German tactical doctrine. It was a strange conversation, almost collegial. The war was over. They could talk like engineers now, not enemies. Then the lieutenant showed Becker an M3 grease gun. Becker had seen them before, of course. Every German soldier who had fought Americans had seen them, but he had never held one, never examined one up close. The lieutenant handed it to him. It was lighter than the MP40, but not by much. The construction was crude, unmistakably crude. Sheet metal, spot welds visible where the receiver halves were joined, a simple wire stock that folded along the side. Becker turned it over in his hands, working the action. It was simple, almost absurdly simple. The bolt was just a heavy piece of metal with grooves cut into it. The trigger mechanism was visible through openings in the receiver. There was no attempt to hide the crudeness of the design. "What do you think?" the American lieutenant asked in German. Becker chose his words carefully. "It is very simple, very crude, but I imagine it works well enough." The lieutenant smiled. "It does. Not as nice as your MP40, I'll admit, but here's the thing. This weapon cost $20 to make." Becker looked up sharply. $20? $20. The factory in Indiana stamps out the parts, welds them together, and ships them overseas. Total labor time is less than 4 hours per weapon. Semi-skilled workers can build these. Women who were making car headlights last year are making submachine guns now. Becker's hands had stopped moving. He was staring at the weapon in his lap, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating, understanding. $20. His MP40 had cost $57, nearly 3 times as much, and the Americans had been producing these things for 2 years, flooding the battlefield with cheap, functional weapons, while Germany struggled to arm its soldiers with expensive, precision-engineered guns. "How much did your MP40 cost to make?" the lieutenant asked. His tone was genuinely curious, not mocking. Becker told him. $57, 15 hours of labor, 36 parts, chrome-lined barrel, precision machining. The American lieutenant nodded slowly. "Better weapon," he said. "No question, but we could make 3 of ours for every one of yours. And in a war like this, 3 adequate guns beat 1 excellent gun. Every time." That conversation haunted Klaus Becker for the rest of his life, not because of anything the American said, but because of what it meant. The Reich had lost the war not because German soldiers were cowards, not because German tactics were wrong, not because German weapons were inferior. The Reich had lost because Germany had approached the war like a 19th century power in a 20th century conflict. Precision over production. Quality over quantity. Craftsmanship over crude efficiency. And the Americans had understood something the Germans never grasped until it was too late. Modern industrial war was not won by the best weapons. It was won by enough weapons. By an industrial base that could churn out adequate firearms faster than the enemy could destroy them. By a philosophy that said a gun that costs $20 and works is worth more than a gun that costs $60 and works slightly better. Other German prisoners had similar revelations. In camps across Europe, captured Wehrmacht and SS soldiers were handed American weapons, shown American equipment, told about American production figures. The psychological impact was devastating. A panzer officer captured near the Ruhr was shown production statistics for American tanks. In 1944 alone, the United States had produced nearly 18,000 tanks. Germany had produced fewer than 8,000. The German tanks were better, yes. A Panther could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's gun was useless. But there were always more Shermans. Always. A Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over France in June 1944, learned that America was producing aircraft at a rate Germany could not match even in its peacetime peak. He had known that American numbers were large, but he had assumed it was because America was bigger, had more resources. He had not understood that American factories were designed for mass production in ways that German factories were not. The Americans built aircraft on assembly lines, like cars, standardized parts, interchangeable components, semi-skilled workers performing simple, repetitive tasks. German aircraft were still built in workshops, with skilled craftsmen fitting parts together, making adjustments, ensuring precision. The American method produced more planes, the German method produced better planes, and in a war of attrition, more always beat better. But the M3 grease gun became the symbol of this revelation for many German soldiers because it was so viscerally crude. You could look at an American bomber and not immediately understand that it was designed for mass production. You could look at a Sherman tank and see a functional, if unimpressive, fighting vehicle, but you could look at an M3 grease gun and see exactly what it was: a stamped metal tube with a bolt and a trigger, a weapon that made no pretense of craftsmanship, that existed only to function adequately at the lowest possible cost, and that crude weapon had helped defeat the Reich. A German ordnance officer, captured in May 1945, later wrote in his diary about the moment he understood: "We spent the war trying to build the best weapons in the world. The Americans spent the war trying to build enough weapons to win. They understood something we did not. In modern war, the nation that can produce 10,000 adequate rifles will defeat the nation that can produce 1,000 excellent rifles. We were craftsmen fighting against an assembly line, and the assembly line won." The irony was that Germany had actually started down the path toward mass production weapons. The MP40 was itself a simplification of earlier designs. The MG42 machine gun, introduced in 1942, used stamped metal parts and was faster to produce than the earlier MG34. German engineers understood the need for simplified, cost-effective weapons, but they could never quite abandon their attachment to quality, to precision, to the idea that German weapons should be the best in the world. The MP40 cost $57 because it was still built to standards that prioritized reliability and durability over pure cost reduction. German engineers could have made it cruder, simpler, cheaper, but that would have meant abandoning the principles that had made German firearms respected worldwide. The Americans had no such attachment to tradition. George Hyde, the designer of the M3 grease gun, was himself a German immigrant. He understood German engineering philosophy, and he deliberately rejected it. His weapon was designed with a single goal in mind: work well enough, cost as little as possible, produce as quickly as possible. Soldier opinion did not matter, aesthetics did not matter, tradition did not matter, only function and cost. By 1945, Germany had produced approximately 1 million MP40 submachine guns at a total cost of roughly $57 million. The United States had produced over 650,000 M3 grease guns at a total cost of roughly $13 million. If Germany had adopted American production methods, if they had been willing to build weapons as crude as the M3, they could have armed twice as many soldiers for the same cost. But that would have required a fundamental shift in German thinking, a willingness to accept that adequate was better than excellent when excellence was expensive. A recognition that modern industrial warfare was about logistics and production capacity, not about superior technology or individual skill. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Germans never made that shift. Even in the final months of the war, when the Reich was desperate for weapons, German factories continued to produce equipment to relatively high standards. The G44 assault rifle, introduced in 1944, was a revolutionary weapon, the first true assault rifle. But it was complex and expensive to manufacture. Germany produced fewer than 450,000 of them before the war ended. The Americans, meanwhile, were already planning for the next war. They had learned the lesson of the M3 grease gun. Crude worked, simple worked, cheap worked. The weapons that won World War II were not. The technological marvels. They were the adequate weapons produced in overwhelming numbers. But here is what nobody expected, least of all the German soldiers who had mocked the M3 in 1944. That crude American weapon, the one that looked like plumbing equipment, the one that cost $20, would go on to serve in the American military for 50 years. Long after the MP40 was relegated to museums and collectors, the M3A1 grease gun would be carried by American tank crews in Korea, in Vietnam, in the First Gulf War. It would be the last World War II-era weapon to remain in active American military service, finally retired in 1992. 50 years of service for a gun designed to be disposable. The MP40, meanwhile, was retired from German service soon after the war. The Bundeswehr, the new West German military, adopted more modern weapons, The MP40 became a relic, a reminder of a war Germany had lost. Some found their way to foreign militaries, to insurgent groups, to collectors. But by the 1960s, the MP40 had effectively disappeared from active military use. The beautiful, precision-engineered weapon that had cost $57 had a service life of less than 10 years in frontline combat. The crude, stamped metal weapon that had cost $20 served for half a century. Klaus Becker, the Wehrmacht sergeant who had held both weapons in his hands in that prisoner of war camp in 1945, survived the war. He returned to Germany, helped rebuild his country, watched as West Germany became an economic powerhouse. He lived to see Germany reunified. He died in 2003 at the age of 84. In his later years, he sometimes spoke about the war. He did not glorify it, did not pretend the Reich had been anything other than a criminal regime, but he remained proud of German soldiers, of their courage and skill, and he remained convinced that German weapons had been superior to Allied weapons in most cases. But he never forgot that conversation in the prisoner of war camp, never forgot the American lieutenant showing him the M3 grease gun and telling him it cost $20. Never forgot the moment he understood that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the factories, that Germany had been outproduced, outmaneuvered, overwhelmed by an American industrial machine that understood modern war better than the generals of the Wehrmacht ever had. The story of the M3 grease gun and the MP40 is not just a story about two weapons. It is a story about two philosophies of war, two approaches to industrial production, and two nations that fundamentally misunderstood each other until it was too late for one of them. Germany entered World War II with a military tradition stretching back centuries. Prussian discipline, German engineering excellence, a belief that superior training, superior tactics, and superior equipment would overcome numerical disadvantages. This belief was not unfounded. German weapons were, in many cases, genuinely superior to their Allied counterparts, especially in the early years of the war. The MP40 was better than the British Sten gun, which was notorious for jamming. It was better than the Soviet PPS-41, which was cruder and less accurate. It was arguably better than the American Thompson, which was heavier and more expensive. German soldiers who carried the MP40 into combat had every reason to trust it. The weapon worked. It rarely jammed. It was accurate at close ranges. It felt solid and well made. But what German soldiers did not see was the larger picture. They did not see the American factories in Detroit, in Indiana, in Ohio, where workers were stamping out weapons on assembly lines. They did not see the shipyards where Liberty ships were being built in weeks instead of months. They did not see the aircraft factories where bombers were rolling off production lines at a rate that would have seemed impossible to German planners. The Americans had industrialized war in a way that no nation had ever done before. They had applied the principles of mass production, developed by Henry Ford for automobiles, to every aspect of military equipment. Standardization, interchangeable parts, assembly line production, semi-skilled labor performing simple, repetitive tasks. The M3 grease gun was the perfect embodiment of this philosophy. It was not a beautiful weapon. It was not a precision instrument, but it could be produced quickly, cheaply, and in enormous quantities by workers who had no prior firearms experience. A woman who had been riveting aircraft wings last month could be welding M3 receivers together this month. A man who had been installing headlights in automobiles could be assembling M3 bolts and barrels. Germany never achieved this level of industrial flexibility. German weapons production remained relatively specialized. German factories required skilled workers, specialized tooling, quality control procedures that slowed production. Even when Germany attempted to simplify designs, they could not quite abandon their commitment to quality. This was not because German engineers were stupid or stubborn. It was because German military culture valued excellence. A German officer expected his weapons to work perfectly, to be maintained easily, to last for years. The idea of issuing soldiers crude, barely adequate weapons was psychologically unacceptable. It would have been seen as a betrayal of German military tradition. The Americans had no such tradition to uphold. American military culture was pragmatic. What worked was good. What worked cheaply was better. If a weapon looked ugly but functioned adequately, that was fine. American soldiers might complain, might prefer the more prestigious Thompson, but they would use whatever they were issued. And American commanders understood that winning the war mattered more than maintaining aesthetic standards. This difference in philosophy extended beyond small arms. German tanks were masterpieces of engineering. The Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, these were formidable weapons. A single Tiger tank could dominate a battlefield, destroying Allied tanks at ranges where they could not fight back. But Tigers were expensive and time-consuming to build. Germany produced fewer than 1,400 Tiger Is and only about 500 Tiger IIs during the entire war. The Americans produced over 50,000 Sherman tanks. The Shermans were inferior in direct combat. A Tiger could destroy 5 or 6 Shermans before being knocked out. But there were always more Shermans. Always. American tank production was so vast that losing 5 tanks to destroy 1 Tiger was an acceptable exchange ratio. The Americans could afford those losses. Germany could not. The same pattern repeated across every category of military equipment. German aircraft were often superior to Allied aircraft in performance. The Focke-Wulf 190 was an excellent fighter. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter was revolutionary. But Germany could not produce enough of them. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was overwhelmed by sheer numbers of Allied aircraft. American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, British Spitfires and Hurricanes, Soviet Yaks and Lavochkins. Not all of them were as good as German fighters, but there were so many of them that individual quality ceased to matter. The mathematical reality was brutal and unavoidable. Germany's entire economy in 1944 produced roughly $100 billion worth of military equipment. The United States alone, not counting Britain or the Soviet Union, produced over $200 billion worth of military equipment in the same year. America outproduced Germany by more than 2 to 1, while also supplying vast quantities of equipment to its allies through Lend-Lease. And American equipment was generally cheaper per unit than German equipment, meaning the numerical advantage was even greater than the financial figures suggested. For every MP40 Germany produced at $57, America could produce nearly 3 M3 grease guns at $20 each. For every Tiger tank Germany produced at $300,000, America could produce 6 Sherman tanks at $50,000 each. German soldiers fighting on the front lines could see the results of this disparity. They saw endless columns of American trucks when German units were still using horses for transport. They saw American soldiers who seemed to have unlimited ammunition, unlimited food, unlimited supplies. They saw American positions defended by weapons that appeared crude but worked well enough. But most German soldiers attributed this to America's size and resources. They assumed America was simply bigger, richer, more industrial. They did not understand that America had also fundamentally rethought how to fight an industrial war. That American planners had decided adequate weapons in vast quantities were better than excellent weapons in limited numbers. The prisoners of war who learned about the M3's $20 cost were forced to confront this reality. The weapon in their hands, crude and ugly as it was, represented a philosophy of war that Germany had never embraced. A philosophy that said winning mattered more than pride, that function mattered more than form, that the assembly line was mightier than the craftsman's workshop. Some German prisoners refused to accept this. They argued that German weapons were still superior, that if Germany had not been fighting on multiple fronts, if Germany had not been bombed day and night, if Germany had had more resources, the outcome would have been different. These arguments were not entirely wrong. Germany did face enormous challenges that made production difficult, but other German prisoners understood the deeper truth. Even if Germany had faced no bombing, even if resources had been unlimited, German industrial philosophy could not have matched American production methods. Because Germany was trying to win a 20th century war with 19th century ideas about craftsmanship and quality, A German officer captured in Italy in May 1945 put it simply, "We were fighting the wrong war. We thought this was a war of tactics and training and superior equipment. The Americans understood it was a war of logistics and production capacity. They understood that crude weapons produced by the millions would beat excellent weapons produced by the thousands. We learned this too late." The $20 M3 grease gun became a symbol of American industrial might precisely because it was so crude. You could not look at an M3 and think it was a technological marvel. You could not admire its craftsmanship or precision, but you could recognize it for what it was, a weapon designed solely to be produced quickly and cheaply, to arm as many soldiers as possible, to flood the battlefield with adequate firepower. And adequate had been enough, more than enough. By 1945, German factories were producing weapons under conditions that would have been unthinkable in 1939. Slave labor from concentration camps, factories hidden in caves and mines to avoid bombing, shortages of raw materials that forced substitutions and compromises, quality control that had become impossible. Yet, even under these conditions, German engineers tried to maintain standards. They tried to produce weapons that met German expectations for reliability and durability. The Americans, facing no such constraints, simply stamped out millions of weapons. M1 Garand rifles, M1 carbines, M3 grease guns, Thompson submachine guns, Browning machine guns. The weapons varied in quality, but they all worked well enough, and there were so many of them that losses did not matter. A weapon broke or was lost. Issue another one. Ammunition ran low? Another supply convoy was already on the way. German soldiers who survived the war and returned home found themselves in a nation that had to rebuild from ruins. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s transformed West Germany into an industrial powerhouse, one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. German engineering once again became synonymous with quality and precision. German automobiles, German machine tools, German industrial equipment were sought after worldwide, but Germany never forgot the lesson of World War II. When the Bundeswehr was formed in the 1950s, it adopted weapons that balanced quality with producibility. The G3 rifle, developed by Heckler & Koch, was well made but also designed for efficient production. German military doctrine emphasized training and tactics, but also recognized the importance of logistics and industrial capacity. The generation of Germans who had fought in World War II carried the memory of defeat with them. They remembered the endless supplies of Allied equipment, the sense of being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They remembered holding American weapons in prisoner-of-war camps and learning that those crude weapons had cost a fraction of what German weapons cost. Klaus Becker, in his later years, sometimes spoke to school groups about his war experiences. He always emphasized the horror of war, the waste of lives, the criminal nature of the Nazi regime, but when students asked about weapons and equipment, he would tell them about the M3 grease gun, about holding it in his hands and learning it cost $20, about understanding, in that moment, why Germany had lost. "We thought we were fighting a war of quality against quantity," he would say. "We believed German engineering would triumph over American industrial mass production. We were wrong. The Americans understood something we did not. In modern war, you need both quality and quantity. But if you can only have one, choose quantity. Because 10 adequate soldiers with adequate weapons will defeat one excellent soldier with an excellent weapon. Every time." The M3 grease gun served in the American military until 1992. It armed tank crews in Korea, where its compact size and reliability in cold weather proved valuable. It armed tunnel rats in Vietnam, soldiers who crawled through Viet Cong tunnels where a short, lightweight weapon was essential. It served in Grenada, in Panama, in the First Gulf War. American tankers in M1 Abrams tanks carried M3A1 grease guns as personal defense weapons, the same basic design that had been introduced in 1942, 50 years of service. Longer than any other World War II American weapon except the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, which is still in service today. The crude, ugly $20 weapon that German soldiers had mocked in 1944 outlasted everything. Outlasted the Thompson that American soldiers had preferred. Outlasted the M1 Garand that had been called the greatest battle implement ever devised. Outlasted the MP40 by more than 40 years. The MP40, meanwhile, disappeared from German service soon after the war ended. Some were retained for training purposes. Some were given to police units. Many were destroyed or sold as surplus. By the 1960s, the MP40 was a museum piece, a relic of a lost war. Collectors valued them, historians studied them, but no military force relied on them anymore. The weapon that had cost $57 and represented German engineering excellence had a frontline service life of less than a decade. The weapon that had cost $20 and represented American industrial pragmatism served for half a century. In the end, the story of the M3 grease gun and the MP40 is a story about choices. Germany chose quality over quantity, craftsmanship over crude efficiency, excellence over adequacy. These were not bad choices in themselves. German weapons were genuinely excellent. German soldiers had every reason to be proud of the equipment they carried, but in a total war against an industrial superpower, these choices were fatal. America chose quantity over quality, efficiency over craftsmanship, adequacy over excellence. American weapons were often crude, sometimes unreliable, rarely beautiful. But there were enough of them, always enough of them. The German soldiers who held M3 grease guns in prisoner of war camps in 1945 were forced to confront this reality. The war they had fought, the war they had lost, had not been decided by courage or tactics or training. It had been decided in factories, decided by the simple mathematics of production costs and industrial capacity, decided by a crude, ugly $20 weapon that worked just well enough, produced by the millions. And that realization was perhaps more devastating than defeat itself. To understand that all the sacrifice, all the suffering, all the fighting had been futile from the beginning. That Germany had entered a war it could never win, not because German soldiers were inferior, but because Germany had misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. The Americans had understood. They had built weapons like the M3 grease gun, weapons that looked like jokes but won wars. They had embraced mass production, assembly lines, semi-skilled labor. They had abandoned pride and tradition in favor of cold, brutal efficiency. And they had won. 50 years later, when the last M3A1 grease guns were finally retired from American military service in 1992, a few German veterans who had survived the war were still alive. Some of them remembered holding those weapons in 1945, remembered the moment they understood why they had lost. The crude weapon that had cost $20 had outlived them all, had outlasted the Reich, the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, had served in more wars than any German soldier had fought in. The MP40 sat in museums, a relic of a failed regime and a lost war. The M3 grease gun served until there was nothing left to prove, until tank crews finally received more modern weapons and the last of the ugly, crude, efficient weapons were sent to storage depots or destroyed. Thank you for watching.